Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, we're going to do a long-term review of the Canon RF600mm f11. I'm pleased to announce the release of my Capture One and Lightroom presets, Metamorphic Portraits, The Sound of Silver, and Rangefinder. These are all available for purchase at my website. Go to kevindealphotography.com or check out a link in the description below. And now, on to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. So the Canon RF600mm f11 has actually been out for, 4 years, 5 years, something like that. I got mine a few years ago, and I meant to do an initial impressions review, and well, time just got away from me. But I've done so many reviews of different cameras where I've used the 600mm, I now find that it's fitting to do a long-term review of this lens. So I'm going to show you a ton of work I've shot on this lens throughout today's episode and give you my opinions of this budget-friendly wildlife/sports photographer lens. But first, let's dive into the specs. The Canon RF600mm f11 IS STM is a super telephoto full-frame lens for the Canon RF system. It uses a retractable locking lens barrel design. It does not have an aperture range because it has a fixed aperture of f11. It has an angle of view of only 4 degrees. Its minimum focusing distance is a long 14.76 feet or 4.5 meters. Its magnification is 0.14. Its optical design is 10 elements in 7 groups, and it does have 5 stops of image stabilization. Its front filter thread size is 82 millimeters. The dimensions are 3.66 by 10.61 inches or 93 by 269 millimeters. Its weight is a light 2.05 pounds or 930 grams, and it comes in at a street price of $799 US. So those are some pretty cool specs. We'll see if the price is justified. We'll see if this is a worthy contender for the budget-minded wildlife/sports photographer, but we're gonna start with a different genre of photography first.
So a lot of you think of birds and wildlife and maybe some sports when you think about the RF600 f11. However, you can use it during the day for things such as surveillance. Maybe you want to stalk that ex-girlfriend of yours. I'm just kidding, don't do that. When you look at the lens, it is very compact, but things can get pretty ridiculous pretty quickly. When you twist this knob right here, it extends out, and then it starts to look like you're compensating for things. And if you want to take things a step further, you can get this ET-88B, and now your lens setup looks absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, unfortunately for this guy, he does not have a setup that looks as cool as this. One cool thing about this though is if you do need to shoot things that are far distance away, it is compatible with the Canon teleconverters, so that's pretty awesome. But let's do some street photography, some really far distance street photography with this lens, because there's still light here in Las Vegas. So let's have a little bit of fun and shoot some of these crazy street performers.
So the 600mm f11 did a pretty good job, as you can see right here. Pretty sharp images for the most part. If you wanted to take a picture of a street performer from a distance and have them not see you, sometimes, you could use this lens for really great surveillance work. You can see right here the bokeh isn't that bad for an f11 lens. Is it a little distracting? Is it 2.8? No, it's not, but it's still pretty good. And as you can see from these quarter to half mile long Las Vegas blocks, it does a great job of compressing the background. Now, compression is a product of distance, not focal length, but with longer focal lengths, oftentimes, you notice it more. Many of you watching today's episode, this is going to be your first telephoto purchase and you're a beginner. So some things you may want to keep in mind if you're considering purchasing this lens. The first one is keep that shutter speed high. When I first got to Las Vegas Boulevard, I was in street photographer mode where I typically shoot at 35 millimeters and I keep my shutter speed around 1/200th of a second. You simply can't do that with this lens, even with the image stabilization. You're gonna have a lot of misses, and I got a lot of misses as I started shooting. So you have to raise that shutter speed, and because you have that fixed f11 aperture, you also have to raise your ISO. Another thing you need to keep in mind is when you see something and it looks pretty good to your eyes, the second you put a 600mm lens up to your eye, it's going to be too close. So oftentimes at the ground level, you may not have anything interesting to shoot. If that's the case, look up. Whether it's the moon or the airplanes taking off from Harry Reid Airport, you can get some fascinating subjects up in the air, and it doesn't even have to just be birds. But back to the ground, I saw Bumblebee from Transformers. I thought he made an interesting subject, but then he saw me trying to photograph him. So the moral of the story is don't hire me to follow your girlfriend.
For the next part of this video, we're gonna shoot some birds. Oh wait, not that kind of shooting, my bad. I actually meant this kind of shooting. So this lens is marketed toward the beginner market, the entry-level market. As a portrait photographer who does not shoot wildlife, I actually feel like it's marketed toward me because I'll probably never be a professional wildlife photographer. And so I feel like that if I can get fantastic results on this, anyone can, because I'm not a wildlife photographer. So I feel like if I get just a handful of good shots today, that makes this lens a great value.
Unfortunately, I only got about 3 or 4 good shots from this trip to my in-laws. The birds were just not out. Thankfully, this is a long-term review, and I've tested out this 600mm with several cameras from my R5, my R5 Mark II, my R7, my R50, and my R8. And on all of those cameras, when I did those reviews, the RF600mm f11 was there with me, and it did a fantastic job of tracking birds. Another thing to keep in mind is you can only move your focus points within that gray box that you see, that large gray box, but you can still compose your subject to the center or off 1/3 of the frame, so that's totally fine for what most of you need it to do. So anyway, let me show you more about how to use the lens, its features. I'll talk about the pros and cons, and then we'll wrap up today's episode.
So the RF600mm f11 is quite light. It's a little over 900 grams. It's about 2 pounds. And operating it is really easy. All you have to do is twist this little collar right here, extend it out, twist it again, and it's locked. There's kind of this fall leather on the end, which is rather nice. And then you also have a control ring right here, which is silver, and that's unlike most of the other lenses that Canon makes. But in general, the construction quality, yeah, it's gonna be lighter plastics to contribute to the lighter weight. And yes, it does have image stabilization, and it uses an STM motor, which is pretty quiet. You can also change it from autofocus to manual focus, and then they have a full and a 12 meter to infinity. So if you're shooting maybe at some birds in the sky and you want it to quickly acquire focus, it will help you achieve that. If you're shooting at subjects that are closer than that, you would put it in the full mode. And the reason why you want to leave it in that 12 to infinity mode, if it is something that's far away, is because if you put it in the full mode, it'll take longer for it to acquire focus. It has to go through the full sweep of the focus on this lens. So make sure you know your situational awareness when using this switch.
So now that I have a few years under my belt with the 600mm f11, let's talk about the pros and cons of this lens. One of the biggest pros of this lens is size and weight. Look at how small it gets when it retracts. It doesn't need a special case. It fits in a standard camera bag, and because it's only a couple of pounds, it really doesn't add a lot of weight. Another clear pro of this lens is that the image quality on it is actually really good. I found that when my settings were right, I'd get sharp images, and then when you combine the autofocus algorithms of the Canon R series up with it, it makes it a suitable solution for outdoor sports and wildlife. And even at f11, you can see right here, I would say that this is pleasing subject isolation. And now to perhaps the biggest pro of them all, and that's affordability. At $799, this guy has the same reach as the $13,000 600mm f4. Now, the comparison does stop there because the other lens is, of course, 3 stops brighter, it has dual motors in it, it has superior optics, it's weather sealed, but if you just need the reach, they are exactly the same in terms of reach, and it gives you a more affordable way to get there. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the 600mm f11 is compatible with the Canon teleconverters if you need that extra reach. But not everything is amazing about this lens. Let's talk about the cons. The first con I want to talk about is that there is no weather sealing. That, of course, could be a deal breaker for some of you wildlife photographers who like to sit out in the rain and wait for your egrets to start flying. You simply can't do that with this lens because it's not weather sealed. Another con of this lens is that it absolutely is going to produce noise because you have to shoot at higher ISOs because you have a fixed f11 aperture, and if you're shooting anything that moves, you're going to have to get that shutter speed high, and I might as well get this out of the way. You cannot use this lens indoors. It's simply going to be too dark. Additionally, you have added expenses because if you want clean images, you're going to have to purchase something like Topaz or some other denoise software. Another con is Canon just being Canon, and they do not include the ET-88B lens hood with this lens, and that's a $50 piece of plastic. Now, if you're like me and you own the RF135, that L lens does come with it, but if you don't have it, you're going to have to spend $50. And then perhaps the biggest con of this lens is that it's simply a one-trick pony. If what you're trying to shoot isn't a far distance away, it's kind of a useless lens. And you may find yourself, if you're shooting on an APS-C, having this focal length be too long for you. And it's not like owning a 35 or a 50mm lens where when you stumble upon your subject, if you discover you're too close or too far away, you just take a few steps back or take a few steps forward. Because in the case of a focal length like 600mm, you may find yourself needing to walk 100 yards back just to get your composition right. And if that's something that is going to be a deal breaker for you, then you need to look at a lens like the newly released 200 to 800mm.
My overall impressions are that this is a fantastic lens if you are on a strict budget. I'm assuming we'll see a price drop on this guy in the near future, and the reason being, of course, is that they just came out with that 200 to 800, which is around $2,000. And I find that that lens would be a much more useful lens than this lens. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, it's going to be a little bit heavier, but sometimes 600mm is simply too long. So having that ability to go back to 200mm, that is a very powerful tool to have at your disposal. And if you need to get a little closer, you can of course take it to 800. So it really comes down to, should you get this 600 or the 800 if you're not going to get the 200 to 800? I would say that if you shoot on full frame or crop, I prefer 600 over 800. I just found that there were instances where even 600 was too tight for me, and so trying to shoot on an 800, I think that unless I'm shooting birds that are far away in the sky, subjects that are far away in the sky, that's just going to be a lens that I'm not going to get a lot of enjoyment out of. As far as this lens is concerned, I do recommend it if you are on a strict budget. It is very well built, it is very light, and I think it's an incredible value. That does it for today's episode. Do you own the 600 f11? Are you going to get the 600 f11? How do you feel about it? Are you going to get the 200 to 800 instead? Or do you own the 800 and you don't like the 600? Tell me about that in the comments below. And if you are a fan of this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And if you like the conversations that I have on this channel and you want to hear my uncensored opinions more in depth, I highly recommend you check out the F11 Photography Podcast. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.